This video was sponsored by Tyvok. For quite a long time on the channel now, I've had my computers on this form of cart. It's basically a desk setup, has its stand legs on there, and I roll it around in the space. So when I'm recording this talking headshot, then I roll it into a different room. It has a 10-meter long cable connecting to the main setup, which is the thing that I'm recording, the talking headshots on and I'm editing the videos on. And it's been working out really quite nicely because prior to this I had a very stationary setup where it would be very difficult to get to the cables at the back. Troubleshooting stuff, became kind of a pain. I've been running into the limitations of this system, and so in this video we're upgrading this, turning it into more of a cabinet style situation, but then with 3D printed inserts just like on the desk setup. Now if we get additional accessories, then we can make a 3D printed insert which just like slides into it. Now in the past I'd have to use a bunch of woodworking tools, which I would really enjoy, but I don't really have a dedicated space to, do woodworking. So up until now I've just been doing it in this apartment, which is why everything is so dusty. This time around though, we're using this really awesome diode laser that Tyvok actually sent over. It's called the Spider X1S Pro, and its main selling point is kind of that it's absolutely massive. I was a little bit skeptical about it, but we'll see how it performs in this video. So there's this website I had out, it's called MakerCase, and what we can do is input our dimensions for the cabinet that we want to make. It turns it into a box, but we can modify that design later by exporting it as a DXF file and then importing that into Shaper 3D. The nice thing about this is it creates all the fingers for the box that you want to create as well. So if you do that manually in Shaper 3D, it'd be busy for quite a long time. So as you see here, I copied the bottom layer and then I created like a middle panel as well. And that's just so that if we have any additional accessories, those don't have to be like piled on top of each other. Those can be on a second layer in that box. After we have that main structure in place, we can modify the design even further to accommodate the 3D printed inserts. I wanted it to be exactly the same size as on the desk setup. If I ever upgrade anything on the main setup, then we can plug it into here if we want to. I had to build this massive desk to accommodate the laser that Tyvok sent over. And the package that they sent over was really quite small compared to how massive the laser actually is, and that's because they work with this rail system, which is really quite smart. You have these tracks that you place over the top of it, which have little teeth on there. And then that middle segment is what houses all of the electronical components, so all of the wheels that make it move up and down the track as well. And I was a little bit concerned about how accurate this would be, because if that track slips a little bit, even a couple millimeters off would be a big deal for engraving something or cutting something. But that didn't really seem to be the case. It was incredibly accurate throughout the entire project. Now throughout the project you'll see me engraving before I do the main cut. This has to do with, I didn't really set it up properly. I didn't offset the axis so that you can use the guidance laser to frame it. So I needed to be sure that everything was going to be okay. But after that first cut I was really quite chuffed with how the machine was performing. It wasn't perfect by any means, but that was mainly my fault because I didn't really input the settings and it's the first time anyway. But it was 300 millimeters per minute at 100% power. At certain points it cut through it really quite nicely. Other points there was quite a lot of charring, but then in the middle it wasn't able to cut through it. And I wasn't entirely sure why that was, and I haven't been able to figure it out since. I think it might have something to do with the multiplex. Maybe there's some variability in the wood, so to say. I moved on to the larger piece, which is the 60 by 60 centimeter one, and that holds the 3D printed inserts in place. This one went pretty well as well. There's still quite a lot of charring around the edges. I kind of gave up on getting that perfect because I think it's because of the base that's underneath it, which is reflecting the laser back upwards, and that's how it's charring the wood quite heavily. But it's not structural in any way, so sometimes you have charring and you press in on it and it dissolves as if it's dust. This is not that, this is still very strong. So those were the top, bottom and middle pieces, and when we went to the side pieces I ran into my first issues. I didn't actually set it up in a proper way with the proper honeycomb grid underneath it. I just put my own sheets of aluminium underneath it, and once they heat up in the center, the corners kind of lift up. So it was lifting up the workpiece on the second cut over here. The laser head, it hit the workpiece and then it dragged it along. In this case I was able to save it by just snapping it in half because it already did one pass, but some of it snapped off a little bit, so that's why you see some of the teeth missing some wood over there. If I really have to nitpick this machine for like negative things, I would say that, you know, that meditative state you get from doing a DIY project with woodworking tools like circular saw and that kind of stuff does somewhat get outsourced to the machine at this point. So you're still very much inside of your own head because you're sitting behind a computer, this thing is doing its thing, and you don't really have control over the situation anymore. That whole reason for why I got into DIY projects is to get outside of my head. That's kind of disappeared with this one. After that, I went back to the CAD program to draw up the 3D printed inserts. These are quite simple, you know, just make some sketch layers and make it drop in a little bit, have overhang at the top over there. In this one though, the screws were in a different spot and I wanted magnets in the corners so that when you place a panel on this thing, it magnetizes onto it. I think this combo package of being able to use a 3D printer in combination with that laser cutter is really awesome though, because you can make very large structurally sound objects with the laser cutter and then complement that with the 3D print, which also somewhat, it works with the design as well. I've been doing this for a long time now, but because the laser cutter is so accurate, it just works a little bit better like this. Now we do need 2 of these cabinets, and the back cabinet is a little bit different from the front cabinet because the front cabinet has 2 additional holes in them. And one of them is for a NAS that I received at the channel. The other one, the smaller one at the bottom over there, is for a power plug that we'll be inserting into it. So if I need to grab power really quickly for an external device like a video light or something like that, then we can plug it in there. And this is also a really awesome point, like you can see it's slowly getting darker and darker. Usually at this point in the project I'd have to stop because the tools would be making too much noise. And you can basically go do an all-nighter with this machine in an apartment complex like this. Initially, I had actually considered using the charred side on the outside and just making that the theme of the build. But eventually I did put the charred sides on the inside here. And the glue up process is super easy. You just shove the 2 fingers in at each other and apply glue in a straight line and then fold them over. If you're enjoying the video so far, then definitely consider subscribing to the channel. If you don't subscribe, then you might never see another one of my videos because it doesn't end up in your suggested feed and you might miss something. If you want to support me even further, you can also check out my Patreon page. I upload all of the designs that I make, so all of the Shaper 3D files, and it really helps out the channel if you support me over there. My initial plan for the project was just to make the cabinets on each side, and then grab the top and bottom segment of the desk that I already had. But then the desk legs would be somewhere else, and I'd have to figure out a new integration for that one as well. So I decided to make the top and bottom as well, and the process for that was really similar to the previous 2. Just went on to make a case, input my measurements, so 1200 by 600 millimeters and 80 millimeters thick. And this is actually just as thick as on the other desk setup, so there's a lot of room inside of this casing for power plugs to be stored. And I gave it the same mounting points as on the 2 cabinets that we made prior to this. This was a bit of a risk because even if it's like 1 or 2 millimeters off, then that becomes a really big issue because you can't get the bolts through anymore. Throughout this glue up process you don't really see me using any glue clamps, but I do actually do that, I just didn't record it. After this I also sanded it down again. Initially this was because I thought we would be painting it in lacquer. I didn't do that in the end because I ran out of time, but it is really nice to sand down the edges so that you get a little bit of a round over, and that way, you know, the edges don't chip off if you hit it with something. So I ordered some of these casters off of Amazon which work really quite nicely. I have them under the workbench as well. The only issue I have with them is that if you encounter even the slightest grain of salt on the floor, it just stops dead in its tracks and it doesn't move anymore. After this we can bolt it all together. I put a washer between each end so that when you compress them in at each other, it doesn't eat into the wood. And I did it specifically in this way because you can also, you know, design it in a way to where everything just glues together. If you do that though, then you can't really take it apart anymore. If you move to a different apartment or a different workshop, then it's going to be a total pain. You need to hire a truck to do that. So we still need to make some 3D printed inserts for the cable holes, and this is something I completely neglected to do on the prior setup, which I kept looking at, and you know, so I thought I'd do it properly this time around. I really like Shaper 3D as well, the CAD program that I use for the projects on the channel, because it's almost as if you're drawing on paper and then you can just extrude it. It turns into a three-dimensional thing, so it's very intuitive to work in this way. I did this on the desk setup a little while ago as well. I added some of these tumbler switches between a power plug. That way you can connect accessories, like for example an Ethernet switcher, or maybe the power plug for the desk setup. And from this little card we can control the power to each specific system. This is really useful for like troubleshooting stuff, right? The quickest way to fix something often is to turn it off and on again. And having those physical switches there looks really awesome as well. And this is part of the first panel that we're integrating over here, so I'm 3D scanning this Ethernet switcher. We'll be upgrading the panels later down the line as well. I make the ports stick out so that we can unplug and plug back in cables whenever we need to. And this is again also like a troubleshooting mechanism. You really quickly want to be able to adjust stuff instead of taking the panels off. This was one of the first prints where I had some issues with bed adhesion, because I've been using the printer for a while and I haven't actually cleaned the bed in a while, which is somewhat of a shame because now the magnets don't work as well as I'd hoped to, but it doesn't really need that secure of a holdfast anyway. In that front cabinet we also still have those power plugs that we need to mount. I have a preset design for this which I made a little while ago, and this is 5mm thick plywood. Laser cut that on the machine, glue it all together, and that holds the power strips in place. I did miscalculate how large the hole had to be, so I had to take a drill to that. As for the computers that we're putting in this thing, these are custom built. They're in these 5000D airflow cases, and this has to do with, I used to build very small rigs essentially until I once had to like upgrade my graphics card, and my graphics card didn't fit in the computer, which totally put me off because it took me so long to actually figure that situation out. And when they're actually like work computers and you need to edit videos on these things, it doesn't become reasonable at that point. After putting the computers in place and doing all of the wiring, I was already really enjoying the look of it as well. I've been rolling around in the studio for about a week, which is really quite cool. And of course this isn't the end of the project because there's quite a lot of panels that we still need to model out and insert into this thing. And I think it's going to be a really awesome project, so I'll link the next episode in this video series once that one is released. I hope you stick around for the rest of it.